Father God, help me preach the truth boldly, with accuracy, and to the point, where we end this Zoom worship somehow through my preaching. Somehow acknowledge that marriage between a church body and the triune God is not a marriage. No different from the type of marriage if I married my wife through Zoom or Skype. Help me make that very clear. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. When you marry someone, there's online dating. People marry someone by going to church. Nothing wrong with that. To find a marriage partner through online dating and even going to church. But just imagine we all got married through Skype internet or through Zoom, where we don't actually see our marriage partner eye to eye, or even touch her or touch him, hold each other's hands, and maybe not have intimacy in the context of having the enjoyment of marriage or even to have children. But we only do this through Zoom or Skype. We don't call that a marriage if you haven't really touched your spouse throughout your marriage. If you don't touch your spouse throughout the marriage, you don't call that a marriage. You call that you just it's no different if you marry a robot through a special AI software from the future, and it doesn't Skype and Skype and Zoom is not to it's not to replace the marriage, the enjoyment of marriage compared to the enjoyment of marriage if you meet that person face to face. Skype and Zoom is not meant to replace that. You have to touch your spouse, you have to touch your children, you have to physically see each other eye to eye when you marry someone. Well, church is the same way. I mean, when we are married to God, when we are married to God, we have to marry God through corporate worship, and where we see eye to eye when when we have our service. It's a marriage between church is meant to be the bride of the groom of God. God is our groom, and the church is meant to be that bride for that groom. And this is not done through Skype internet or even Zoom. It's a reflection of marriage between a body of believers on a special day like this Lord's Day on the Sabbath and our holy God. It's a marriage. But you don't call it a marriage if you married your wife or your husband through Zoom or Skype. You don't call that a marriage if you haven't really see eye to eye that person. You don't call that. There's a lot of things that Skype and Zoom can't really replace. That a marriage that I enjoy with my wife under the same roof in our home, and we call that a marriage. But church should be a type of marriage between a believer, a group of believers, and our holy God. And right now, we're making we're not having we're not having the type of relationship, the marriage relationship between the church and our God through Zoom or Skype, which I see as somewhat heretical. And we're so dependent on Zoom. Obviously, I'm using Skype or YouTube to broadcast my message. We're so dependent on YouTube, Zoom, and Skype that we're actually replacing real relationship with people, with IT, with technology, which is no different if I were to marry my wife through the internet, like Zoom, Skype, or YouTube. It's no different. Right now, we're being desensitized by the internet. Where right now, my concern is, what are you going to do if you go to fellowship in the church through Zoom? What are you going to do if an EMP attack happens? What are you going to do? You see, everybody is so dependent on technology that it becomes a type of Tower of Babble in the book of Genesis. It's becoming a type of Tower of Babel where everybody is replacing real fellowship with technology. And that is going to be a danger. Right now, everybody is so comfortable doing Zoom and YouTube, and they may not want to go to church at all. They may find the actual attendance of going to church no different from Skype or Zoom, where people will find church fellowship no or less relevant how they feel when they watch a Zoom broadcast on YouTube or Skype. It's becoming a danger that that we have to acknowledge uh, before everybody stops going to church completely. I really believe that people will stop going to church completely when they found out that Zoom is no different from the actual fellowship in the body of believers. That's my fear, is that church will find church irrelevant, where they will actually stay home every week and of the year, even when they are vaccinated from the coronavirus. That is the future that we need to acknowledge, that it can happen right after everybody gets vaccinated, that people will stop fellowship completely when they find Zoom no different from how they feel at a church when they worship God. And let's say an EMP happens. What you going to do if an EMP attack happens? When an EMP attack happens, um, there is no Zoom, there is no Skype, and there is no YouTube. All of our computers and cell phones and tablets will be destroyed in the EMP attack. We're so dependent on technology that we may end up being totally confused, like the people in Babel, like in the book of Genesis. We're repeating a disaster similar to the Tower of Babel, because during the construction of their tower, they're trying to build a tower which is no different our dependence on technology, for example. We're trying to build an IT infrastructure like Zoom and Skype and YouTube to replace fellowship. This is the real ultimate aim of Zoom, Skype, and YouTube is to replace fellowship with technology. Same thing like building the Tower of Babel to compete with God, to replace the actual worship of God through the Tower of Babel. And we're doing this Skype and internet no different the way they're building the tower. But guess what God did as the people of Babel were building this tower? He confused them, which is no different from an EMP attack in the future. This is a possible, I'm not saying I heard vision. I'm not saying I saw a vision from God that this could happen. I'm not saying that, but based on what I read on the internet, it is very possible that, excuse me, it's very possible that China and Russia have a EMP technology to destroy all of our IT infrastructure in the United States. And what the Russians and Chinese that could do to us would be no different how God, no, maybe not a little different. I mean, similar how God confused the people in the Tower of Babel when he unleashed uh, confusion to the people of Babel when they built this tower. My fear is that when there is no Zoom, when there is no YouTube and Skype, everybody will be as confused as the people who were confused in the Tower of Babel, who are so dependent on the tower. The people of Babel were dependent on building this tower when they are doing their own form of worship. The same way we are so dependent on Zoom, Skype, and and YouTube. We're so dependent on technology. No different that what is happening in the Book of Genesis. And it is very possible that God could unleash an EMP attack from the sun, for example, to eliminate our access to Zoom, YouTube, and Skype. So what you're going to do? Well, this is what I'm doing. Um, I'm trying to get to know everybody where I live. I somehow know that the people in my community where I live, next to my home, will be my new church. This is where my church will start during the end times. When an EMP attack does happen, and I pray it doesn't, I'm going to find a way to organize a church community near my home where we live, and somehow worship God when an EMP attack happens. And it's going to happen, possibly in my lifetime, or it may never happen, but there's a good chance it will happen because I'm seeing a repeat of history, a repetition of historical events in the Bible, like the Tower of Babel, being dependent on the tower, same way we're being dependent on Zoom. And when the people in Babel failed to build their tower, um, that could be no different if an EMP attacked us when we no longer have access to Zoom anymore or even YouTube. This can happen in the future. And I'm not saying I didn't hear an audible voice. I did not hear an audible voice for your information. I did not see any dreams about this. I based this speculation. I formulated the speculation that it could happen by reading the book of Genesis on the Tower of Babel. That's how I made this forecast. It's not a prophecy that I hear from a voice from God. I'm not saying that. I based this forecast based on reading the Bible, that it did happen in the book of Genesis when God confused the people in Babel when they built this tower. Tower. Why I have a difficulty pronouncing the word tower. I said towel like some kind of sugon in the bathroom, but I meant tower. Yeah, I meant to say tower. And we're no different from the people of Babel in the book of Genesis. You and I are no different. We're building this tower of unbelief through Zoom, the same way they build their tower, the actual tower of their unbelief through this tower to commit out of their unbelief. We're no different from the people in Babel when we're so dependent on the internet. And obviously, I did touch the issue of marriage between the church and God, and the marriage between husband and wife. And I also discussed the possibility of an EMP attack. And I just want to mention one more topic that before I end this message, because during the 1980s, TV evangelism became um, the thing to worship God. I remember my youth and many years ago that we argued with people from Robert Schuller that you can't worship God through watching TV. I remember the good old days when before Obama, before George W. Bush, we argued with other liberal Christians, so-called liberal Christians, that watching TV is just not a form of worship. You're not worshiping God by watching TV. This is before Skype and Zoom, and all the Robert Schuller. When I told him that, I told a Robert Schuller follower that you need to go to church and that you should stop watching TV to worship God. And he said, "You're not mature, Joseph. You have to grow up." That's um, what he said when I told him that. I don't know whether you remember who Robert Schuller is. He's the pastor, the former pastor of Crystal Cathedral. He's the former pastor of Crystal Cathedral. And right now it bankrupt, and his son somehow took over the church franchise, and right now he has his own church and no longer doing any TV broadcasts. And to my surprise, during COVID-19, Robert Schuller's son, Robert Schuller, the elder, passed away or retired. His son still have church services during COVID-19. Even though he could die from COVID-19, he was having these worship. And I didn't know that until I heard another Christian broadcast. And it's never talked about Robert Schuller's son meeting on Sunday during COVID. And the very person we criticize Robert Schuller, that you gotta tell the other believers to go to church. This is watching TV is just not worship. I remember telling them. Actually, the very pastors, like Mariners, Calvary Chapel, and Harvest, and even Bethel Korean Church, we always told them not to watch TV like Robert Schuller, and consider that worship. You have to be in a church. We all told them that. And the very person we told him that, like Robert Schuller's son, that you should worship God in a fellowship, the very person we told him that right now is having fellowship in a body of believers in a church parking lot, of course. And during COVID-19, he's the only pastor who did that before John MacArthur and other churches decided to have these indoor services or outdoor services to worship our God on the Lord's Day. I mean, I understand that all of you are afraid to die. For me, I'm not terribly afraid to die when I go to Costco or Target or Walmart. I'm not afraid to die. I don't think that I would die by going to Target, Walmart, and Costco. And yet, all of the people in church think they can die by going to church. And yet they think they can get away from death by going to Costco and Target. But the reality is, the chances of you dying from COVID-19 is far greater in the airport or airplane than in the actual church that worship outside. God can see our contradiction, our inconsistencies, and our lack of faith. And you don't marry a wife and husband, or between a wife and husband, through the internet. You have to touch them, kiss them, eat with them, see eye to eye when you meet with them, see their tears, their joys. That's marriage between a man and a wife, which is a reflection of the marriage between a body of church believers and 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 the groom, who is our God, Jesus. It's a type of marriage between. The reason why God allowed marriage between a husband and wife is so that we can enjoy marriage. That that too, but the biggest reason why God allows marriage between husband and wife is to understand what marriage between a church like in a fellowship like we should be going on the Lord's Day and our holy God. It's a marriage who is the groom. That's the purpose of worship. That is the purpose of the fourth commandment in the Bible, to keep the Sabbath holy. It's to enjoy marriage between believers like us and our God. If I tell you that an EMP attack won't happen, then why did God talk about the Tower of Babel in the Bible? Why he talk about it? We're repeating the same mistake that the people in Babel were doing in the Bible. We're repeating the same mistake. They're dependent on their tower the same way we're dependent on the internet, like Skype and YouTube and Zoom. We're no different from the people in Tower of Babel. No different. I understand that nobody want, nobody wants people to die. I don't want people to die. But I don't want to dishonor our God who died for us. Jesus died for me, died for you, died for my children and my wife. Jesus is everything to me. Everything, even at a point of death. At a point of death, I want to follow God. Really. But every time I go to church and disagree with the church leadership, what fellowship means, what Sabbath means, they will ask me to leave and call the police to tell me that I'm not welcome in their church. Because my views on the fourth commandment is so offensive to believers out there who think that Zoom is okay, the same way that Robert Schuller believers think it's okay to watch TV on the Lord's Day and call it fellowship. We're no different from the Robert Schuller believers before COVID-19. We're no different. And we're building our internet infrastructure. We're so dependent on this internet infrastructure. It's the same way that the people of Babel are so dependent on when they build their tower in the Bible. We're no different from them. We're making the same mistake. If you could pray for me, I'd like to organize a church community where I live in my home, because I really believe an EMP attack can happen in my lifetime, and we're so dependent on Zoom and internet that God knows it's our sin, it's our dependence on technology that He will someday take that away from us. I know He will during judgment, during the end times. Because what happened in the Tower of Babel is a reflection, a forecast, what the end times will be like. A forecast. we're making the same mistake. If you can pray for me, I'd like to start a church in my home community where I live during the end times. Because during the end times, you will not have access to the internet or cell phones or computers or even a workable car. You're not going to have access to it. That's why I bought some bicycles for my girls and for myself and my wife in case we don't have a car. Because it's going to happen. Just pray I start a church community where I live.